Welcome back to Passions Over Pancakes. My name is Hannah, and I am the host and creator of this podcast, a project in which we talk about our passions while we eat pancakes. I want to welcome you and encourage you to take off your coat and stay a while, grab a cup of coffee, make some pancakes, and also, if you wouldn't mind hitting that subscribe button and leaving a like, a review, or rate this podcast, that would be so appreciated. This podcast also wouldn't be complete without pancakes, so I'd like to thank Bob's Red Mill for graciously sending over a big old box of pancake mixes for me to try and use on this podcast. Now that the housekeeping is out of the way, I'd like to introduce you to our first interview guest of 2022, Kurt Jenkins. Kurt is a multidisciplined artist with over 20 years of experience in the entertainment industry. His career as an actor and performer has taken him around the world, starring in musicals Million Dollar Quartet, The Buddy Holly Story, Ring of Fire, and more. He now lives in Birmingham, Alabama, where he's currently developing his first feature film. You can follow him at Kurt Jenkins on most social networks, as well as listen to his original music on all streaming platforms, and all of those will be linked below for you to check out. All right, let's go ahead and get into it. Hello, Kurt, and welcome to Passions Over Pancakes. Thank you so much for being here on this interview today. I am so excited to have you here, and I'm really, really grateful that you're willing to be on this show.
Well, cool. Thank you very much. I'm happy to do this. This is actually the first podcast interview thing I've done ever, and the first piece of what you'd say publicity that I've done in years and years and years. So this is it's great on many levels, and I sincerely appreciate you reaching out to me. I'm very thankful to be here. So thank you.
Absolutely. Okay, well, I can't wait to dive into this. Before we kind of get started into some questions about your background, who you are, and just your different types of passions, would you be willing to tell the audience who you are, what you do currently, and just a couple things that you're wanting to talk about during this interview?
Yeah, of course. I would say the easiest way to say what I do is I'm an artist. I've kind of had a ping pong career. Like I went to film school, but then I kind of skipped a lot of film school to play guitar, and I've discovered my love of music, and then I combined that with my love of theater when I was in high school to do what you would call guitar theater, which is theater where the actor is the musician on stage. So you're playing a character who the character himself is a musician in real life or in fiction. And so it's sort of a concert and a play. And that's sort of what was been the majority of my career. And then I kind of went from there, toured the world, toured the United States. And then once COVID hit, that kind of changed everything. And now I'm sort of rethinking what I want to do, going back to my first love of filmmaking, and then also learning the skill of sales, and that's a whole other animal. I'm very new to that, so that's like the newest part of my journey.
How did you get into that love of filmmaking? Let's start there.
Back to the Future is probably the nucleus of where me wanting to make films and me wanting to make music starts, and it's kind of a cliche story. There's a lot of people like John Mayer was inspired to play guitar with Back to the Future, Marty McFly, Michael J. Fox, Johnny B. Good, like that kind of started a lot of, kids' journey to play the guitar back in like the late 80s, 90s. And I was definitely affected by that. What got me into film, it's this like world that doesn't exist anywhere else. And it's shown in a way that doesn't exist in real life. Like the way that you watch it, the way that a movie presents itself with like the camera angles and sound design and editing, everything surrounding that is real and not real at the same time. And I think I've always been drawn to the ability to recreate a very honest human experience with tools and presentations that couldn't be farther from how we experience our life. Like, I don't really know how to explain it. It's just something that always made sense to me. When I watch films, it always was like, oh, I understand that. Or when you see a great piece of film that moves you, I just understood how to do it. I was like, oh, I just see how that's done. Same way with guitar, it just made sense. And so I figured, well, why don't I do things that make sense to me? Just as like a kid who was naturally gifted in math or science or whatever would just lean into what was easiest. That's kind of what I did. And so on a practical level, I just sort of followed what I wanted to do. And I had a friend in elementary school and middle school. And so we would, we'd make the whole videos. We would take the latest Weird Al Yankovic songs and make music videos from them. I remember us doing like Amish Paradise and that kind of thing. And I just knew that I wanted to do it more and more. And it kind of grew from there. And then I went to film school and then realized kind of immediately when I got into film school that film school was useless, but I did it anyway because I was in school and I wanted to get my degree. But it kind of just grew from there. And then I got out of it because I was playing guitar at the time and I found I was getting really good at guitar. And then I, again, followed the path of least resistance. And I was like, well, this is easier and it's quicker and I'm young. And so I know I need to capitalize on maybe whatever career I can have in music while I'm young. Because there's no like 35-year-old, up and coming pop stars. And not that I ever was a pop star, but I wanted to be. That's a long story, but that's kind of how I got into filmmaking. Is just I understood the relationship between image and sound and design.
Wow,
Yeah.
that's a really cool background to that story too. That's fantastic. So with filmmaking, how does your background in acting and guitar and all of that play into how you can become the best filmmaker that you want to be?
Well, I was actually talking about this with a filmmaker the other day. There's this guy named Cody Clark, and he calls himself a truly independent filmmaker, meaning that a lot of independent films they're funded by Hollywood subsidiaries and they're still, starring A-listers, and they're not really independent. They're just small, they're just lower budget. And so he's a truly independent filmmaker because he has completely abandoned any desire to be in the Hollywood system. And he makes his own films the way that he wants to for zero money, $1,000, something like that. He's a musician as well. And he was saying that, he's like, I hope you realize how important it is and how lucky you are to be a musician and be a filmmaker, because the rhythm of film and the rhythm of editing is so important. And he was like, I can't tell you how many films that I've seen by people who you could tell have no rhythm, like internal rhythm, because they don't know how to like conduct a moment the way that we feel it. So, if you find yourself, well, I find myself when I made my last short film I made was called Personal Best, and I wrote it. I did like everything because I wanted to see what it felt like to do everything. But you find yourself conducting the scene, like you're watching it on the monitor and you're like doing this, like waiting for the moment. And in a way that's a form of conducting, and that is music, that is rhythm. Acting is the same way. And I find that the more arts mediums that I've dabbled in throughout my career, the more I realize that everything is the same. It's all the same. It's like when you go to a Mexican restaurant or an Italian restaurant, everything, like a Mexican restaurant, for instance, it's all tortillas, cheese, beef, vegetables, guacamole, sour cream, rice, beans. But it's just the combination of them creates the burrito, creates the quesadilla, the empanada, blah, blah, blah. And it's the same thing for any artistic medium. Film has a lot of the same components as acting. Music has a lot of the same components as architecture. You just have to sort of like learn about them all and realize that, oh, that's that is that. And that's why things are so translatable. And so that is essentially my process and my desire to do all different types of things, is because I realize that they're all connected.
That's awesome. I love that. And that sounds like a whole heck of a lot more work than just being on one end of things or one side of things, whether it's acting or just filmmaking, not just filmmaking, but the entirety of filmmaking. It sounds like it's a jack of all trades and master of all is something that you have to be.
The phrase that we know is jack of all trades, master of none. But the actual full phrase, if I believe, I'm still paraphrasing here, but it's jack of all trades, master of none is better than jack of no trades, master of one. It's something like that. It's basically, the full saying is basically saying that, like, at the end of the day, it's better to be familiar with a lot of different things than to only know one thing and have no context for everything else. And it's very easy to do that nowadays because our attention spans are like that, and it's very easy to kind of dabble. We're kind of this dilettante culture of like everyone is everything, and the role of like the true master is a little bit lost in today's culture. Maybe not, it's not as important because masters are rare. People who truly devote their life to one kind of craft are rarer and rarer, because there's so much more to pay attention to now than there was 100 years ago, or even 20.
Absolutely. So true. So going along with that, then I have two questions for you. I'm going to start with the one and hopefully it'll feed into the other.
Mm-hmm.
With you mentioning the attention spans of everybody with social media and just everything going on in our world that's just so fast paced, do you find that it is more of a catch to stay relevant and to catch up to stay relevant in social media and in this world? Or are you really just honing in on your talent and skill and growing it little by little from what you have? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And I don't know. That's kind of where I am right now. I don't know exactly where I fit in the world right now. My life, I've told this to my fiance before, like my life would be a lot easier in some ways if I didn't want to be an artist, because I would know like all I want to do is make money. Or like all I want to do is just go into business and build a business and make as much money as possible and sell that business and blah blah blah. But like art is so nebulous and there's no like it's very easy not to make money doing art, you know? And where that fits in with my brain of trying to, you know, I mean, I would love to be legitimately wealthy. I have that desire. Like I like the idea of building wealth. I think it's fun. The little times that I've dabbled in it, I can see how it's fun. It's like a video game. But then also art is so mysterious, and it's like the juxtaposition between science and religion. And I don't know where I fit in with that, because essentially as a filmmaker, being a filmmaker in 2022 is almost a fool's errand considering how almost irrelevant cinema is. Video content is still very relevant, video content, but cinema itself, like when I think of like the golden age of American cinema in the 70s or like the indie movement in the 90s, like that isn't really a thing as much as it was back in the day, because people, like, I still love going to theaters, and theaters are still a big thing, but Spider-Man No Way Home grossed $1 billion. Like those are the kinds of movies that people want to see. And the movies that would have been in theaters in the 90s, like the challenging dramas, those are on Netflix. But even on Netflix, people are watching them very few people are watching them actually projected on 100-inch screens. And even then they're projected digitally, which looks different, sounds different, and it's just not the same. And so it's very easy to get maybe bitter at the people who don't want to see it your way and as a purist, but there's also room for innovation. I was watching an interview with James Cameron, and he was talking about how he has this idea for a movie, you know, in a future model of distribution where he makes a 6-hour and 8-hour movie, and if you want to watch it streaming, you can, and it's the full 8-hour version, or you can go to the theater and see the truncated 2.5-hour version. So he can both release it in the cinema and release it at home for people who want that different viewing experience. And again, I don't know where I sit in that. Like, I don't know. Like, do I want to do augmented reality cinema? Do I want to make cinema for the metaverse? I have no idea. And that's part of what I'm figuring out right now.
That's so awesome. So going along with that, you had mentioned a little bit before the interview about two different versions of yourself, pre-COVID and post-COVID. How has filmmaking and just your life in general, with all the craziness that has happened over the last few years, how have you been able to find yourself through your passions in these last couple of years?
Well, first of all, I have to preface all of this by saying that my life in comparison to millions of others during COVID has been a cakewalk. So anything that I talk about with regards to a struggle or regards to a hard time is very relative, very first world problem kind of thing, because fortunately I haven't had anybody in my family or immediate circle who's been like who's passed away or even been like extremely negatively affected by COVID. So despite the struggle that I've been through, I'm extremely grateful that I've experienced such little disruption relative to others. Having said that, I got to get that out of the way to stop people from going, oh, your life is so hard, huh? Yeah. For sure. COVID made me realize how brittle everything is and how much we take for granted and how much I was living off the high and false reality of the world that a successful performer or artist lives in. Because if the great thing about being successful in something like a performing world or the arts is you get to live a very like dreamlike life where you always get special access to things and people are always catering to your needs and you're getting paid well to do things that you love, and the problems that you have aren't really that bad. It's like, oh, am I going to get paid this much or this much? Like that, like, oh, am I going to do another show? Wah. It's like that kind of thing. And so when the world comes crashing down and you have all your work taken away in 48 hours and you never know when that work's going to come back, you start to realize like, oh, this thing that I had actually it's paper mache. It's not real. And that was a blow to me, honestly. I was living kind of a dream life, and I hadn't prepared for these black swan events as well as maybe other people have, other artists have even. And I had a huge ego death in that regard of like, there was a period where I was like, am I going to quit everything? Like, I was like, I'm not Kurt Jenkins anymore. I just need to exist as a human being, a soul, and then I will build myself back piece by piece, and whatever comes back, comes back. Like I'm not playing guitar a lot these days because it didn't come back as strong as my desire to make films or my desire to maybe learn how to build wealth in the stock market. And so like, yeah, it sucks, but it's something that I just had to accept and say, well, that's what post-COVID Kurt is. You know, like it's weird, but through that, I'm a better version of myself because I had to learn a lot of humility. I had to realize that I was living in comfort and I was not challenging myself as much as I needed to challenge myself to do the things that I truly wanted to do. I worked landscaping for 2 or 3 months after COVID hit because it was the only work that I could get guaranteed. And imagine going from living on a cruise ship where you're literally a celebrity, to literally shoveling rocks down a hill 8 hours a day in the Alabama sun. And you're sweating, you're in your uniform and like to do that within a period of 2.5 weeks, like to go from my life as an actor and performer, I will be working to I'm shoveling rocks down a hill for 8 hours a day. That, to someone who isn't prepared for that mentally, like that was really a shock. And then you realize that then you look over and you see a dude who is an immigrant from Guatemala and you're thinking, well, God, man, this is hard. And he looks at you like, this ain't hard, dude. This ain't hard. Coming from Guatemala, moving your family to America, this is paradise. And it's like, wow, it's this really big shock of, life is hard and not at the same time, and everybody is so unique in how they see the world, and you really cannot trust your view of reality because there's so many other ways to look at it. And that just took me a while to solidify into a new, hopefully better version of myself.
Wow, that is quite the journey for sure. How cool.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for explaining all that. I feel like that gives myself and hopefully the audience too a little bit of a perspective as to how much things can change. And I know all of us have experienced that, but in each individual's lives, it's so interesting to hear how certain things affected everybody and especially their passions. So that's so interesting. All right. Well, at this point, we are going to take a quick break and we will be right back with Kurt Jenkins and the rest of his story. This break is dedicated to you standing up and giving yourself a good little stretch, warming up your coffee or warming up your pancakes if any of those have gotten cold. In all seriousness though, having you listening to my podcast right now is just a feeling that I can't explain. I am so ridiculously appreciative of you supporting this podcast and this little pet dream of mine. I can't thank you enough for being here. This podcast cannot happen without people like you who are willing to listen to these passions as well as tell passions of their own. If you have a passion, whether it's big or small, your job, a side hustle, or even just a pet dream of yours, please reach out to me. I want to hear from you. I want to hear about your passion, and I know other people do too. The entire reason for this podcast is simply to give a platform for people who do want to talk about their passions, whether they feel silly about it or not. So with that being said, the 2 ways that you can reach out to me are at passionsoverpancakes on Instagram or passionsoverpancakes@gmail.com. Please reach out to me if you do have a passion that you want to talk about. I would appreciate it so much, and I can't wait to hear from you. Without further ado, back to the podcast. All right, y'all, we are back with Kurt Jenkins, and we are going to continue on this story of his life and his passions and his creativity, and I'm just so excited to continue. So buckle in, get your pancakes, and let's keep going. Yeah. So Kurt, I know that you have been in a lot of different places doing a lot of different things. Tell me more about how where you've lived has affected your creativity.
You have to go out of what you know. You have to see things outside of what you think you know. And living in other places, I think I've lived in Birmingham, Orlando, New York, Chicago, and on a cruise ship, which took me the Caribbean, took me to the Baltic, like Russia and Copenhagen, Sweden, Helsinki, things like that. And it showed me that humans are different and the same at the same time, and that a lot of the differences that we have are really kind of just made up. They're not necessarily inherent in our DNA. Like St. Petersburg, for instance, felt a lot like the United States in certain ways, whereas like Mexico felt less like the United States, but it had the human element that felt similar, regardless of the fact that like the culture is different and maybe the food and the architecture and the landscape. It's something along the lines of it solidifies what you know to be true, and it expands what you didn't think you thought was true in this weird way. And so that it increases the objective and the subjective at the same time. So like there are definitely cultural differences in Russia in terms of like maybe how men and women interact with each other, maybe how like the art is, or like their relationship with the history of their country. But at the end of the day, they're all just individuals who are trying to live their best life. And when you're dealing with creativity or things that I want to deal with, which hopefully is, universal themes, it kind of is a breath of fresh air because, like, oh, everybody will react to the same kind of thing. It just may have to be tailored to a culture or, a reference that this country that can understand. But at the end of the day, like, all humans react to creativity similarly in terms of story, how stories are. Like, regardless of whether you're from Russia, Mexico, United States, the story of what it is to be human is the same. And that's very comforting because it makes the thought of creating something, the stakes are a little lower because if it's done well and the archetypes are taken care of, then no matter where you live or where you're from, you're going to understand it and hopefully even be moved by it.
And as you're talking about that, I was thinking about how I'm sure everybody has learned about the hero's journey in their English class or at some point in school. And I don't know for sure, but I'm assuming that's the same everywhere in the world. When you learn about it, the hero's journey is the same.
I mean, yeah. That's why Joseph Campbell wrote Hero with a Thousand Faces, is because it's the story that has taken place throughout history that everybody, I mean, it's exactly why movies like Star Wars were so big, is because it's the story that everyone understands in their DNA, whether they understand it or not. They just get it because they're like, oh, that's me, Everyone is their own hero's journey, in a sense, That's kind of how we see the world, is through our story rather than, just a life, which is complicated, which makes things very complicated.
For sure. Oh, yeah. I love that. Put that on a t-shirt. Everybody is their own hero's journey. I love that.
Yeah.
Okay. So another thing I'm super curious about is your sales experience. Have you found that those correlate at all, or can you use your sales experience in that creativity and vice versa?
Yes, in a way. I'm relatively new to sales. 2021 was the year that I decided that I wanted to figure out a way to make money online, because with me no longer pursuing performing opportunities and me wanting to lean back into the world of film, I knew that I had to find a way. I basically told myself, what is the way for me to make the most amount of money with the least amount of work? That was the template. I was like, if I can find that, that's what I want to do. And I tried a bunch of different things. I tried like flipping things on eBay. I tried freelance copywriting, a couple other things, and I hated them. Like I loathed them to my core. And then I saw a video a couple months ago, probably back in the late summer, about selling, like high ticket sales, like selling high ticket products to people who need them, and you get a commission. I was like, I can do that because I'm an actor and I at least have a foundational understanding of people and behavior and empathy. And if I can temper my own desire for attention and focus on the person, then maybe I can communicate them and get them to, buy whatever product that I'm selling. And so that's what I've been doing for the past 3 or 4 months, is learning that skill. And I'm like a kindergartner at it in the grand scheme of things. But the general principles of sales that can apply to something like filmmaking is that, with films, especially with me wanting to be independent, you're going to have to raise money, and you have to learn how to raise money from people in a way, because essentially film is a product that you're almost never going to get a return on investment. So you have to sell to someone in a very specific way, because it's not like, well, you give me $10,000, I'll give you $1 million in 30 days. It's not something like that. Those are actually very easy offers to sell, because if someone has any business knowledge and any guts, they'll see that and they'll say, oh yeah, that's a no-brainer deal. But for something like a film or something like the thing that I'm selling, it's sort of like, well, I don't need it, but I could use it and it could benefit me, but the ROI is a little bit less tangible. And so that is how sales can be utilized in the filmmaking process, because you're dealing with so many different types of people, and you have to learn to communicate and essentially get what you want out of all types of people, personality types, moments. You have to be able to like understand what a person is going through in that exact moment and be able to relate to them and get them to trust you. An actor comes on set, they've got a big scene, but they had a terrible night last night, and so they're not really in their head. They're in their head and they're not really focused. You have to know how to talk to that person in that moment in a specific way to get them to give you what you want in a performance. So you're talking to an executive producer, and you need more money, or the bank, or blah blah blah. It's all this. It's the glue that holds the film industry together is sales, essentially. It's just not talked about. Sales is everything. If there's one person that's watching this video that wants to that is inspired to listen to my music or watch a YouTube video, like essentially that's sales. It's persuasion, influence, anything like that. But it's very nebulous and it's hard to catch and hard to tie down, but it's what runs the world, essentially, sales.
Yeah. And I mean, even in conversations with strangers, you have to sell yourself. And so selling yourself is a lot different than selling a product or selling a ticket, and you're so right. Just tailoring everything to the individual. That's so interesting.
I thought that I knew rejection as an actor or an artist, but you have to, if you're ever, or if anybody watching this is in sales or curious about sales, it's like you have to check your ego at the door and realize that the minute you start taking things personally, or the minute you start thinking, well, if they don't buy from me, that means they don't like me, or that I'm worth less, you're going to have a very tough time. And I've had to fight that instinct, because I'm a very sensitive and emotional person, just by my nature. And I've had to like harden certain parts of myself, because if you have 6-7 calls a day, say you don't make a sale in 2 days, if you have to realize that like it's maybe not you personally, maybe it's a method, maybe it's a tactic you're not using right.
That sounds like a great way to improve yourself in all aspects of life, is to be in that type of position where you might get rejected, you might not, but like you said, you have to be able to not take it personally, and that's going to make you some type of a stronger person in a lot of aspects.
Yeah, it's a healthy type of callus that you have to develop on your inner side of you, because you're going to get rejected a lot in everything that you do. There's going to be things that if you're learning a new skill, you're going to fail a lot, and you just have to get used to that, because there's so much comfort in today's life, in today's world, that you have to expose yourself to challenges every day just to be at a baseline, or else it's so easy just to like forget your work for an hour and scroll through TikTok or watch YouTube videos, or when you get done with work, you're tired, so you'll just watch a movie every single night, and then that goes into other things that sort of kill your progress by just leaning into comfort too much. And not to say that like your life needs to be like a freaking crawl through the mud all the time, but if you want to do anything above what the status quo deems to be acceptable, you have to go above and beyond of what you have to be. People have to think you're crazy, essentially. If you want to do anything great these days, the average person has to look at you and think that you're crazy, because the average person is not doing those things and they're fine with it, and that's cool. But sales is a way for you to really see what you're made of emotionally.
That's a great way to put it. finding out what you're made of emotionally, but also making money while you're doing it. So it's kind of a
Yeah,
win-win.
sure. It's great. It can be no, it can be very lucrative. It can be very lucrative, but I've found that I can't focus on the money. You can't with anything that has potential for high earning potential. You can't really focus on the money. You can't be driven by it. I mean, I don't know if you're religious or if people in the audience are religious in it, but it's like you can't serve two masters. You know, you have the money has to be an outcome and a tool. But at the end of the day, you have to serve people. You know, if all I did was come into a sale and think, well, how am I going to suck this much blood out of their bank account? You know, I'm not going to be good. And if I do make a sale, I'm going to feel dirty afterwards because I feel like I manipulated them or something. But if I have something that people honestly want and I can show them how their life is improved by this product or service, then I've actually done them a favor and they'll actually like love me for it, not be skeptical about it. So that's kind of how I have to look at it.
For sure. Awesome. Okay. Well, I know that you have a lot of opinions, and I'm so excited to hear about your opinion on how fitness and wellness enhances creativity in your experience.
Yes. Okay. Again, I'm going to preface this to the audience that I have not formulated any of these opinions in science. They're just things that I've noticed for myself. So take that what you will. You know, you can look at me as a crazy person or someone that maybe is worth listening to for a second. I don't know. But, you know, I find that it's really like it's simply as I can put it, a healthy body makes a healthy mind. And if you're going to be creative, you need to like have a sense of discipline about yourself, but also be willing to completely abandon that discipline and go completely crazy at the same time. And what I mean by that is, you know, I find that I've never been happy with something that I've worked on unless I've gone completely tunnel vision, balls to the wall with it, completely focused. Nothing else matters but the one thing. Like when I was working on music that I put out on Spotify last year, a couple years ago, the only way that I finished it was that I didn't post on social media. I barely talked to my friends. I would just get up, eat, make music, go to sleep. That's all I did. And so, but in order to do that, you have to have the discipline in a fitness sense and an emotional health sense. And that's like eating right, sleeping right, you know, pushing yourself in the gym, because the more that you push yourself and the more that you embrace discomfort that comes with things like fitness, like really like a lot of discomfort, you can push yourself elsewhere. And so creativity and innovation in creativity comes from finding new ways of doing things outside of what is accepted, like in sort of the mainstream, or, you know, commonly known or commonly thought of. So you have to be willing to push the boundaries of your own psyche. And if you're unable to push the bounds of your own body, how are you going to be able to push the bounds of your own psyche? Because a lot of what you do in the gym, pushing yourself, it's mental, it's not physical. Your body can take almost anything, but it's the mind that makes it happen. And so I'm sort of rambling, but that's the general foundation of it, is that the more you can push yourself physically, and the more you'll be able to push yourself mentally. And if you're a creative, you sort of tailor that push mentally with whatever you're creating. And there's also a lot of science to show that, you know, when you work out and when you sweat and when your blood gets pumping, it actually increases your cognitive ability. So like there's the science, and then there's the spiritual side of it. And that's like my general thesis on it. I know that's not a very popular opinion with some people, because people think you can never work out a day in your life and be just as healthy and, you know, with it as other people who work out every day and blah, blah, blah. And I just don't believe that.
I'm in the same boat. So yeah.
I don't believe that. Yeah.
Yeah. And I love your attitude about things like sales and creativity, and also things like pushing your body, because you are pushing your body to its limit, but you're also pushing your mind to its limit. And I read somewhere, I don't know where I read this, but your mind gives out a lot faster than your body does, especially when working out. Yeah. And I think that applies to a lot of different aspects of life. I think that applies to creativity. I think that applies to work and the gym. You know, your mind is going to give out a lot faster than anything else. And if you have that motivation, or that discipline rather, and I mean, it also helps to have people outside of you pushing you and encouraging you to do things. That's going to make a huge difference.
Yeah. Like I was at the gym yesterday, and I was doing reps on the bench press and I didn't count. I didn't count the reps. I was like, this is the weight that I'm going to do. And I'm going to do 5 sets, and every set I'm going to increase the weight. And this is, I don't know whether this is like, if a fitness expert would think this is a good idea, but just from my own mental state, I did it. I was like, I'm just going to put weight on for every set, and I'm literally just going to do as many as I can until it really hurts and I can't do another one. Because if I told myself I'm going to do 5 sets of 8, then every time I get to 6, I'm going to think, oh, it's hard. I got 2 more. Yeah. But if I just kept doing it, I probably could do 15 because I wasn't even thinking about the number. I was thinking about each rep was like, okay, form, make sure my form is good and make sure I do it in a way that is safe, and I'll monitor my body and how it feels. But I'm just literally, I would do 30 if my body could take it. But as soon as I started counting, that's when my mind started creeping in and say, okay, well, even if you could do 10, you're not going to do it because you said you were going to do 8. And so I imagine if my mind works that way with fitness, where else can I apply that philosophy in my creative life and my career and my business and all that stuff?
Absolutely. Wow. That I'm going to have to try that next time I'm in the gym tomorrow. How cool. I've never even thought about doing that. Okay. Well, the next thing I want to talk to you about, and the thing that I'm probably most excited to hear from you about, is synesthesia.
Synesthesia, whatever.
That's synesthesia. Well, I don't know why that's so hard for me to say, but I would love to hear from you about it.
Well, do you know anything about it?
I know you've talked about it just a little bit, but I don't know enough about it to be well-versed in it. And I'm sure probably a lot of people listening also don't know.
Yeah, synesthesia is it's the neurological phenomenon of multiple senses being combined involuntarily. And usually the most common form is, if you just Google synesthesia and you hear people talking about it, usually people will say they have something called grapheme color synesthesia, which they associate a number with a color, like, or a letter with a color. Oh, A is green, or this is blue. And like, that's a really common version. And there's dozens of types of synesthesia. This guy, I think Robert Seidlwick, wrote a book called Synesthesia, like an MIT book. And I have a book I just bought called the Oxford Handbook of Synaesthesia, and it's like that thick. It's really thick, and I want to read it. But it's an involuntary phenomenon where, you know, you can taste ideas, or you can, I don't know, smell a sound or something like that, and that's really rare. But the kind that I tend to have is I get really strong mental images when it comes to sounds. So like if I'm mixing music, I'm hearing the music coming out of the speakers, but there's also a visual representation of that music in my head that is like an overlay to my field of vision. That things either represent themselves in like different shapes, wireframes, or colors, or different textures and things like that. And it's not like an acid trip. It's not something that's completely, that overtakes my vision that I can't even do it. But like, that's just kind of how I experience a lot of art and music. So like, if there's a really loud noise or something, like a color will just completely block my field of vision and I can't see for a second. It's like that kind of thing. And so it started presenting itself when I was in college a little bit. I started noticing it, and then I just sort of leaned into it and found a way to utilize it. It's interesting because it's not as strong as it was maybe a couple years ago, but it's like a knob. I can turn it on, I can dial it up, or I can dial it down. Lately it's been a little turned down because a lot of what I'm doing is, I guess, more analytical and maybe left-brained. So it's like sales is a little bit more analytical, so I'm not paying attention to it as much. But whenever I sort of get into more creative moods or mindsets for a longer period of time, the knob starts to turn up and I start to feel things a little differently. And that helps me a lot, like when I'm storyboarding a film, or if I'm writing music, I can hear everything in my head and see the images that go with it. Or I don't know. I mean, what specifically do you want to know? Because I could ramble all day about it, but like, what are you curious about with regards to that?
For sure. Well, I think that was a really great basis of what that is.
Yeah.
How has that impacted your creative side? How have you been able to utilize that within your production of music and film and all of that?
Yeah, okay. There's one of the songs that I wrote called Crossfight that's available on Spotify to listen to. The bridge of that song has a lot of different things going on in it. Like if you listen to it, you'll hear it in the mix. It's sort of this unified rock mix for the choruses, and then when it goes into the bridge, everything kind of splits apart and it becomes like this multi-part sort of thing. And the way that I was figuring that out is I would like sing the parts to myself, see the images in my head, and then like draw the images that I saw in my own head that corresponded to what I was naturally singing, and then figured out what that looked like and felt like on the instruments, and then put those in different places. And then as I was mixing it, it was like trying to visually put together a puzzle, and all the puzzle pieces had to match and none of them could overlay with each other. And that's kind of how I built the bridge mix of that song Crossfight. So that's a way that I like used it practically, because I was able to see where the music was not fitting and where it was. And that affects like the tone, that affects the volume, like the mix of each instrument. When you're building it, it becomes a bunch of separate pieces. And then when it clicks together, it becomes one big piece. And I can like feel it and I can see it when that happens. And that's an example of how it looks practically. And I feel like a crazy person when I'm doing it, but it's a benefit. I mean, it helps me a lot. It helps me a lot.
Yeah, for sure. What was the process like when it started to present itself when you were in college? What was the process of leaning into it like?
When I started leaning into it, it really was like listening to music and saying, well, we say, what does this music look like? Like there's this song, this guy named Carl Jenkins, oddly enough, wrote this. He has this music called a diamus, and it's like this world of music where he makes up his own language, and it's a lot of instrumental music. And there's like this jazz song, but it's like a jazz orchestral song, and there's a moment where the chord changes very unexpectedly, and the guitar has this really unique note like that the guitar player plays. And when I think about it and when I listen to it, it would sound like a diamond double helix that like swirls out of the speakers, like that kind of thing. And so it was just about me finding, well, what does Jimi Hendrix sound like when I'm thinking of it like that? What do the Beatles sound like? What does the News sound like? Again, it sounds like I'm a crazy person, but it allows me to see things in my own way. And then and that affects things too. Like I can get into it, like in terms of a costume design. Like I'm developing a film right now, and once I start to get a sense of what the music is, well, what does that sound look like in my head, and can those images be transposed to a texture that can be used in the character's costume? It's like that kind of stuff. So it really is just it's a process for me to connect, going back to the beginning of our conversation, to connect everything. Synesthesia is like the great connector in my brain that I can run it through my synesthesia filter and output it to whatever part of the process I'm working on. And it's not perfect. It's not something that's like immediately quantifiable, but it's just a way for me to interpret the world.
That's awesome. How cool. Yeah. I've heard about it and I've looked into it just a little bit, but just here.
Have you ever experienced anything like that? Like, have you ever like heard something and thought like, oh, that sounds like this?
If I haven't registered it, and it hasn't been something that I've thought, oh, and then, taken that and thought more about it. I don't think so. And I'm trying to think of a time that ever may have happened. And I don't think it has. I was a huge, band nerd in high school and in college, and doing all of the classical pieces. I think every once in a while, if I'm in a conversation and something sounds familiar, I'll think about that song, but I've never had the experience of seeing a color or, putting those types of things together. I've never had that.
Okay. And the reason I ask is that I'm constantly trying to disprove that this is real to me. I'm constantly trying to like feel like, oh, I'm just I'm just, playing make believe in my head. And so that's when I ask you this. I'm like, have you experienced this? Because if a lot of people were like, oh yeah, I experience this all the time, I would think, oh, maybe this is more normal than I think. But I tend to talk to people and they're like, no, I don't know what the heck you're talking about, which makes me think, okay, this may be something that is actually real with me and not something that I just wish were real because it sounds cool, because that's like, the last thing I want to be is like pretentious with it, or like, that's why I don't really talk about it very much, because it sounds kind of pretentious. Well, I have synesthesia. I can see my art. And I don't want to be that guy. I want it to be a very practical tool. And I'll talk about it if I get asked about it. But because I thought, I was like, well, maybe I could be like the synesthesia guy on YouTube and like talk about this stuff. And it's like, it's kind of, I just don't want to be that guy. I want to make films and use my tools or my gifts or whatever, but not be like my personality.
For sure. And it's cool that you're trying not to make that your personality, but at the same time, you're utilizing it so that you can be an absolute creative in every way and utilize that to your advantage. I think that's so cool. All right. So I've got a couple more questions just to wrap this up.
Let's do it.
The first one is, what is your process like when you are storyboarding a film and that whole process? I've seen on your Instagram stories, you have the flashcards laid out on the floor. What is your process kind of in a quick way? Don't give away all your secrets, but from beginning to end, what is your process like?
Well, I mean, right now what I'm doing with that story that you saw, just for people that have never seen it, I'm developing a film and I'm trying to just get a sense of the rhythm of the story itself. And there's it's a very basic, accessible book called Save the Cat. That's a sort of a very accessible screenwriting book. And he breaks down the screenplay in a variety of different beats that are like pretty universally common across all films. Like every film has these kinds of beats if a more traditional structure. And so my process now is that I have index cards of like all the different points that he hits. And then the other day I just wrote out a bunch of index cards of scenes that could be in this movie. And I was like, okay, well, there's no context to these scenes. These are just things that I think are interesting for an idea in a movie. And then I put them in order based on how they could correspond to the beats. And then I, read through it a bunch of times until it made sense. I mean, that's one process, but when I'm actually storyboarding, what I'll do is, you take the script and you say, okay, say he runs into a restaurant. It's like, okay, it's an infinite number of ways that you could capture that shot. He runs into a restaurant. Is the camera attached to his body looking up? And so he's like running like you see like in the Hangover movie when Ed Helms is hung over in the beginning. Like, is it that? Is it an overhead shot? Is it a shot on the ground looking up and he's running away from the camera? So like that process is kind of intuitive based on the moment, because you have to think, okay, what does this sentence mean? Who's he running? Is he running away from something? Is he running to something? Why is he running? How fast is he running? How wide is the door? It's all these things that you have to answer. And then you reverse engineer the meaning of that shot or the meaning of that moment into a shot. And that's called mise en scène in film. Basically the way that the camera's relationship to the story in a moment. Mise en scène, I think, is like setting the scene or something like that. So that's kind of my process. And so that after I figure out the intention of that line and why that line is, how that line fits into the story, then I'll start playing around in my head of, okay, what does that look like from a camera movement? And that, I think, that's where cinema is. That's where cinema comes to life versus just like a content creator. Is because when you watch cinema or a movie, whatever you want to call it, it's very different than like a video made by a content creator, because there's that extra step of like, it's putting the microscope on the microscope on the microscope, where it's like so subtle that it's unconscious, but it doesn't look right if it's not exactly that. That's why like Martin Scorsese makes a film, like a content creator and Martin Scorsese could have the same script and make a completely different film, and one would look like a film and one would look like a YouTube video, because it's the process of thinking like a filmmaker as opposed to a video maker or a content creator. And so, again, that's a very long-winded answer for my process. But I try to look for references in film and then reverse engineer the meaning using the different language, the different types of camera language and image language. Yeah.
Thank you for taking us behind the scenes on all that.
Yeah.
That's really cool. And it's cool to be able to see. I highly encourage anybody that's watching or listening, follow Kurt on Instagram and any social media platform. We'll get to his platforms in just a minute, but it's so interesting to see your process. And you've done this, I think, if I remember correctly, you've done this for the previous film that you've done. You kind of laid out everything and showed the behind the scenes on Instagram. And it's just been so cool to watch as you've continued being a creative and you've just continued to let people in on that process. I think a lot of people aren't willing to let other people in on that process, and there's totally a time and a place, but it's just really a good opportunity to be able to see what you're doing behind the scenes, how you're thinking about things, and just being able to watch you put everything together is just such a special and unique opportunity online to see.
Yeah, it's all, I think the reason a lot of people don't do it is because when you're in it, like if you're truly in it, you don't necessarily have time to document the stuff while you're doing it. I mean, it takes a concentrated and a split effort in a way. Like I was able to do that thing with my short film Personal Best because I had so much time on the cruise ship that I had literally had time to document it and make the thing. And I'm sure that if I forced myself now, I could still do it. I think that's probably an excuse on my part. But oftentimes when you're doing these monumental types of creative tasks, it takes up all your bandwidth. And so you don't have the extra bandwidth to look outside of yourself to think, well, how do I document this and develop it and make it good and have the documentation be accurate and timely? Because then you got to edit the videos and you got to put them out. It's just a lot of creative bandwidth to stretch your brain. So I would love to do it more because I find it very rewarding for the people who watch. Like in 5 years, if you want, I would love the film that I'm developing now for people who imagine your favorite filmmaker or your favorite musician or whatever, and you could see how they made their film that you like the best. They had a 12-part series free that broke down how they did everything. And so I think it's something that's really cool. I mean, it's essentially behind the scenes that you get with a film, but it's done from the filmmaker's point of view, not like the studio's point of view. Because I mean, because I would eventually love to hire, my dream is to be able to hire, are you familiar with Gary Vaynerchuk?
Yes, I love Gary V.
I would love to hire my own version of D-Rock, like his videographer. So I do the work, I can do the work, and then they can film me doing the work and put out the content. That's what I would love to have. But I have to make enough money to hire someone to do that. I have to pay them handsomely because that's quite an undertaking.
Absolutely. Very true. And it's a slow process too. You'll get there. I know that you will. And that's going to be really cool to watch from this point on. It's going to be really cool just for everybody who's watching and listening to watch you grow into that person. And then everybody's going to be able to say, I watched that interview before he was anything on.
Yeah. Well, hopefully I'm, my goal with this kind of interview is to call it like Babe Ruth, to be like, that's where I'm headed, and then just, crack it. That was a terrible baseball cracking noise, but that's not what baseballs do. It's like that. That's probably more appropriate.
There you go. Second time's the charm.
Exactly.
Okay. Well, 2 more questions for real this time.
Yeah, please.
When you are putting out content, what is it like after putting out the content? Are you consistently thinking about things that you wish had been tweaked, or are you one of the people that's like, okay, it's out, it's done, there's nothing I can do about it, and that's the way that it's going to be? How do you think about it after you've put it out into the world?
Oh yeah, I don't put anything out unless I love it.
For sure.
I don't put it. Because the things that I have put out haven't been under a strict deadline. I will go over it and over and over and over it until I love it. The film that I put out, Personal Best, I see some things in it, and I think from a story perspective, I'm like, oh, that could be better. I could learn from that and get better at it. But I don't move forward with something until it affects me emotionally in the moment. And even if I look back on it a couple years later and think, oh, or maybe have things that I would have done, it's more from a perspective of, oh, this is what I'm going to do this time that I've learned from this, as opposed to me thinking, oh, that sucks, I hate it. Because I still listen to my music on Spotify every now and then just to make sure that I still love it. And I'm like, yep, I still love it. I'm still happy with it. It's not the best recorded stuff in the world. They may not be the best songs in the world. The mastering may not be perfect. But for what I was able to do in that moment, it came out almost exactly how I wanted it to in my head, both with my music and my short film that I made a couple years ago. And that for me, I'm happy with. I'm happy with. I'm not one of those artists that are like, oh, my work sucks. It's like, no, really happy with what I do. Like, I don't put it out unless I'm happy with it.
Yeah.
Because if I don't like it, then who else is gonna, if I'm not happy, if it can't move me, then it's not gonna be able to move anybody else.
So true.
Yeah.
So true. And I love that perspective because I feel like anytime you see something on social media or you talk to somebody, it's always, oh, I wish I could have changed one thing, or it's just not totally perfect. And so it's really cool that you have everything that you want before you put it out into the world. And then after that, it's, I love it. I still love it.
Yeah.
It doesn't get old.
Yeah. I mean, there's always going to be things that you wish you'd done differently. Like, oh, maybe I could have done this and it might have made it a little better, in the moment. But again, I look at it from a perspective of, oh, I'll do that that lesson that I learned, I'll do that next time. And a lot of it comes with a really long, intense pre-production phase. Like, I don't know are you familiar with Stanley Kubrick very much? Like, have you watched many of his films?
I don't think so.
Okay. I mean, like, have you ever heard of like 2001 or The Shining or Eyes Wide Shut?
Yeah.
Okay, that's him. He's probably one of the most like obsessive, detail-oriented filmmakers that's ever been. Like, his pre-production phase was almost as long as his actual shooting phase. Or excuse me, his pre-production phase was actually much, much longer than his shooting phase, which is typical. But he was so obsessive and so smart and so detailed that everything he had on the screen was a result of sometimes years of pre-production, not just ideation, but like literal pre-production. Like, we are planning this film for 2 years before we shoot for 6 months, which is like, that's a lot of doing, which, he was very successful. So he was able to have that afforded by the studio. But I imagine that with that kind of thing, you know what you're getting before you even make the film. So like, you already love the film that you've made before you even shot it because you know what's going to happen. And then you have to be open enough to the experience to realize that it's never going to be exactly how you want it because you're working with tons of people and on a set, and everything's unpredictable. But you just have to know what you're capable of. Because I don't like this maybe it's our generation or whatever, but this like fake humility and this like fake sense of like, well, I suck, I suck, but like I don't, that kind of thing. Just stop it. Is the difference between being humble and knowing your place in the world, and also having confidence in yourself to be able to know what you can do. And you can bridge that, thread that needle without being a jerk. And also not being like fake humble. Because people who are fake humble is just another form of attention seeking. When it's good, when it's good, I'm going to say that it's good. And when it's not good, I'll say that it's not good. For myself, yeah. I'm not putting that judgment on other people's work. I'm just saying that, like, for me, like, I will objectively say in certain instances, like certain parts of my songs, I'm like, that's as good as anything that's ever been put out. Ever. Mm-hmm. And like certain things, I'm like, that's fine. Or not good. Or whatever. But I'm willing to say that, and I don't care if people think I'm, cocky or whatever.
Oh, for sure. And I think, honestly, we need more people like you with that attitude of call it like it is, because anything else is, like you said, just fake humble, fake anything. And we don't need more fake people in this world.
We do not
need
more
limelight.
fake people. No.
Yeah. I love that attitude. Oh my goodness. Okay. Last and final question that I ask all of my interviewees. What would you say to somebody who was wanting to be a creative or a filmmaker or somebody that creates music? What would you say to them as encouragement? They're just barely starting. They might not even have a guitar yet. They don't even have a camera. What would be your encouragement and your advice to them to get to where you are and where you want to be?
I would say, I can't speak on their like technique or how they're going to do it, because that's subjective to the individual. All I will say is that, well, two things. If you want to be full-time and as a creative, and like you want to do it for real for your life, you have to learn the business of it, and you have to find a way to make money at it. At least enough money to pay your bills and to save some money for the future. Because otherwise you're going to constantly be like, you're either going to do two things. You're going to be nervous, the fact that you don't have enough money, and you're going to like never do the thing because you're always going to be nervous because you feel like you can't make enough money at it, or you're going to be someone who's like a starving artist and you're going to be bitter towards the people who do have money. So like, because there are people who have, or filmmakers and creatives who are millionaires upon millionaires, and there's a lot of people who hate those people and they're just jealous. They're not necessarily, it's not that, but like, I would say that you have to focus on your craft. You have to learn exactly what you want to do from a technical level and start at the foundation, and avoid 6-minute YouTube videos that tell you how to do things. Like, go to the foundations, like the textbooks, like the science of the thing. I can speak, technically really only to film and music, but like learn about the science of it, the engineering of it, and try to avoid the shortcuts, the fast food content that, 10 hacks to be a better filmmaker, like that kind of stuff. And at the same time, learn the business and learn exactly what you want to do and how you can monetize that without without worshiping and being a slave to monetization. Other than that, make whatever you want to make and don't listen to people. Learn to tell the difference between people who are criticizing you constructively and people who just want to hate. Because you're going to have haters. In fact, the more haters you have, the better, because that means that your work is actually reaching people. Because you're actually, if you have a bunch of people who hate your work, a bunch of people are going to love your work too. And like that's probably better than a bunch of people just going meh. Because nobody remembers the meh. Everyone remembers the people who were polarizing. Who divide opinions without dividing people, I should say. Don't divide people with your work necessarily, but maybe divide opinions. That's all I can say right now. I'm still learning.
Absolutely.
That's awesome. And I love that you're speaking to the monetization of it as well. I don't remember when it was, but I remember you, when you were doing films on you, not films, but little vlogs type things on YouTube. You had said that during all of your time on YouTube, there was a time that you had made 10 cents entirely on YouTube. Oh, yeah. And it was enough to buy maybe a piece of gum. And you gave a little bit of a spiel afterwards about it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter that, like, eventually it'd be great if I could make money on YouTube or doing this type of things, but it doesn't matter. I'm building my craft. I'm putting out my work. I'm becoming a better creative and a better creator. And no matter what happens, that 10 cents, what's it going to be when I'm a millionaire? No big deal.
Yeah, sure.
And I had to start somewhere.
Yeah, exactly. But you have to, there's a time and place for the money talk. There's a time and place for business, and there's a time and place for creativity. And if you under index either one of them, you're going to suffer. But the people, you have to figure out a way to make money, because you eventually might have a family to provide for, or, you may just want to go on vacation and not just be a starving artist all the time. I've thought that before. Like, this goes back to what I was talking about with sales. Like, I've lived mainly a middle-class life for the majority of my life. And when I look at the potential of the next couple of years of like wanting to break tax brackets and like get to be more high net worth, it can be a challenge because you're used to that. And then you start thinking like, well, what's it going to be like if I get to be a millionaire? What does that look like? And when you've never even thought about that, it can be kind of a tough conversation with yourself, because you have to admit to yourself that you have to put in more work than you've ever had to put into, and it takes courage. I've heard some people say it doesn't take money to make money, it takes courage to make money. And if you can do that while still being true to your artistic self, then man, I mean, that's the alchemy right there.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Many
wise words have been said in this interview, and I'm really grateful for your passion and for your creativity and just your wisdom in all of this. I think you've been in this process a lot longer than I have, for sure, and a lot of people probably listening. And so it's really great to get an insider's view on a lot of this stuff from somebody like you who's been a part of this creative community for so long. So thank you so much for being willing to chat about all this. Yeah, well, thank you for having me on. It was a great experience. I'm really glad. Where can people find you on social media? Mainly I'm on, I would say, YouTube and Instagram are my main two in terms of social networks. Kurt Jenkins. Instagram, it's like Kurt Jenkins _, but if you type in Kurt Jenkins, you'll find me. I think I'm the most active Kurt Jenkins on Instagram, and I gotta buy that handle one day. And I'm also on Spotify. If you Google my name, Kurt Jenkins, you'll see me on Spotify. And then I'm, basically anywhere social media is Kurt Jenkins I have the handle. And everything that Kurt has said and mentioned in terms of books and things like that will be linked below. All of his social medias will be the first links in the description box on here and also on the podcasting platform if you're listening on Anchor or Spotify. So yeah, go ahead and check him out. Please listen to his work. He really is fantastic. You're not going to regret taking the time to listen to things. So yeah, thank you again just for being here and being willing to talk with me about these things. And I'm really excited to see where we're going from here. And I'm really excited to say that I know you now and that we've been chatting, and I'm just really excited to see where you go from here.
Well, thank you very much for having me on.
Of course. All right. Thank you everybody for listening, and we will see you next week.